Hello, everyone, and welcome to our discussion on anxiety in the time of COVID. I'm Judy Bayer. I'm a family doctor in Coburg with a special interest in mental health. I'm just going to get my slide show up here. There we are. Anxiety in the time of COVID. When I was thinking about the title for this talk, I thought what I'd really like to call it is 10 easy steps on how to eradicate anxiety in your life forever. I thought that might catch some attention, but there were some problems with that title. First of all, there's no easy steps to overcome anxiety. Also, I would be doing you a disservice if I gave you a magic formula to get rid of all anxiety in your life. We have anxiety for a reason. God created us with vigilance to protect ourselves and those around us. It was anxiety that reminded our ancestors to run from the saber-toothed tiger, and it's anxiety that keeps us social distancing in the time of a pandemic. And thirdly, when we try to push anxiety away, it just gets worse. In order to illustrate that, I have a picture here of a cute pink elephant. I have a task for each one of you. I'm going to ask you to close your eyes, and for the next 30 seconds, do not think about the pink elephant. Okay, we're going to start now. Okay, how did that go for you? Most people will say that when they try not to think about the pink elephant, the image just keeps popping back into their head. For those that say that they can go the whole 30 seconds without thinking about the elephant, they find that they had to work at it hard. They had to work on distracting themselves and reminding themselves to think about something else. So if you can imagine, if it's that hard to think about a pink elephant, not to think about a pink elephant, how hard must it be not to think of anxious thoughts and images day in and day out? The more we try not to think of the anxious thoughts and images, it gets bigger and harder to push away. So instead of eradicating anxiety, we're going to talk about resilience. Resilience means strength and flexibility. When we talk about psychological resilience, we talk about bouncing back from a psychological or mini crisis. But I'm not only going to suggest that we want to bounce back after this pandemic, but that we want to move forward. The world is going to be a different place when this pandemic is over, and we are going to be different people. And hopefully during this time, we can learn new skills as we face the journey ahead. Before we really get into the talk, though, I'm going to ask for a timeout. This is to treat my anxiety as a family doctor. There are several people, 3 groups of which I'm thinking of, who may benefit from some of the pointers in this talk, but I would strongly encourage to reach out for professional mental health counseling. First group are frontline workers who are experiencing trauma at this time. I'm thinking of hospital workers, long-term care workers, emergency medicine workers, both in the ambulance services before they get to the hospital and afterwards. Also, many essential workers. First of all, I want to say thank you. And also, some of these workers are going to experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Some already have, some will in the future, due to the fact that where they're working is in many ways similar to a war zone. The good news is that there's very good trauma programs available. Second is those who are experiencing grief. There's an anxiety associated with grief at any time. You feel that your feet have been knocked out from under you and you have trouble getting your footing again. But that's even more difficult at this time. Grief tends to be complicated during a pandemic. And thirdly, for those who are experiencing severe symptoms. You might ask me, what do you mean by severe? Well, if you think that your symptoms are severe, reach out. If you're experiencing symptoms which are interfering with your day-to-day functioning, many hours of the day, most days of the week, for 2 weeks or longer, please contact your primary care provider and access mental health services, either privately through your employee assistance program or other private health care, or through your local community mental health center. I've got the website here for our Northumberland Hills Hospital Mental Health Center, which has a virtual walk-in clinic. If you're in crisis, we ask you to call the 24-hour crisis phone number available to you. The number here is for our 24-hour crisis phone number in our area, or go to emergency room, especially if there's thoughts of self-harm. And speaking of emergency room, if you have physical symptoms such as chest pain or shortness of breath, please do not assume that that's due to anxiety, but make sure that you get that checked out by a healthcare professional. Thank you. My anxiety is much less moving forward. Today we're going to talk about anxiety acceptance, distress tolerance, and suggest a few tools for regulating anxiety. These tools are maintenance tools. Sorry, there's no quick fixes here. First of all, I'm going to compare the pandemic to a vacation that my husband and I took a few years ago. It might sound odd, please bear with me. I hope the analogy will become clear with time. A few years ago, Michael and I, along with my cousin Norma and her husband Roy, decided to take a walk in England. We started on the west coast in St. Bees near the Lake District, started walking in an easterly direction, and about 3 weeks later, we ended up at Robin Hood's Bay on the east coast of England. It's called the Coast to Coast Walk, and it's a walk across the skinny part of England. As you can see, it goes through 3 national parks, which means lots of elevation, beautiful scenery, and something I didn't really appreciate until we started the walk, peat bogs. The first day, we dipped our toes in the Irish Sea and started walking up the fells of the Lake District. And after a little while, I was lagging behind my hiking buddies and noticed the ground was getting somewhat wet. I saw an area of bright green vegetation that looked like a good place to step, but once I'd put my weight on my foot and stepped on it, my foot, ankle, and lower leg all disappeared. I had gotten stuck in the bog up over my knee. First of all, I was alarmed as the ground opened up underneath me, it seemed. I was annoyed then as the water seeped into my hiking boot, and then the what ifs started. I remembered reading on the internet before we left about someone who lost their hiking boot in a bog and had to walk the rest of the day with one wet stocking foot through the trails. I thought, that doesn't sound very pleasant. And then I remembered another story I'd read of someone who got stuck in a bog up to his waist. His friends were able to pull him out, but he had to walk across a cold, windy moor, soaking wet from his waist down. And did I mention that the bog has a characteristic smell? It didn't sound like a very pleasant experience. And then I looked around me, and as far as I could see, there was bog. And I started to think, what if the whole 3 weeks is spent walking through this boggy ground and just slogging our way through? Is this a way for me to spend a vacation? Now, if someone had offered at that point a helicopter to pick me up out of the bog and drop me off at my bed and breakfast that night, I would have taken them up on it. I would have been sitting in dry clothes by the fire, drinking Yorkshire tea and eating biscuits when my hiking buddies caught up to me at the end of the day. It sounded appealing, but we didn't have a budget for a helicopter in our vacation budget. And so I had to just pull my foot out of the bog. Luckily, my hiking boot came along with me, and catch up to my hiking buddies. And I did complain about my very wet foot for the rest of the day, but the ground became solid again, and we actually had a pretty good time for the rest of the day. The next day, we started out again, and what do we run into but another bog? Now, if I had been able to be helicoptered out of that first bog, how do you think I would have felt facing a second bog? I think I would have been searching the skies for another helicopter, and I would have had significant trepidation facing the second bog because I hadn't made my way through the first bog. But because I had learned that I can pick my way through and that it isn't the end of the world to hike the rest of the day with wet feet, I wasn't quite so worried about this second bog, and I picked my way through it a little bit better. And the hike continued that way. With each boggy patch we encountered, we each developed our unique way of hopping and jumping through the bog. And each time we got a little better at keeping our feet dry, though they weren't always kept dry. We also learned that we can tolerate the distress and the discomfort of going through the bog and having the wet feet that we had as a result. I don't mean to make light of the pandemic or of the anxiety that people feel, but in some ways, the situation is similar to our coast-to-coast walk. It's not a short hike, it's a long trek with ups and downs, and there's difficult patches along the way. We can't ignore the boggy patches. If we had some way of being helicoptered out of the difficult patches, it would just make us less able to face the future bogs ahead. But all we can do is put one foot in front of the other. And with each boggy patch we encounter, we get a little better at navigating our way across. And we also learn that we can tolerate the distress and the discomfort that is associated with that. And of course, we learn there are moments of beauty along the way. I wouldn't want you to think that the Lake District is all bogs. There is beautiful scenery along the way as well. So as we talk about anxiety, acceptance, I do think we maybe need to acknowledge the elephant in the room. Isn't there something that we're all thinking, even if we're afraid to say it? Aren't Christians not supposed to feel anxiety? What does the Bible say? When I'm going to ask you to think now, what is the first Bible verse that comes to mind, or part of a Bible verse, when you think about anxiety? Most people will come up with a verse, anxious for nothing. It has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? I typed in "be anxious for nothing" on Amazon Books website, and 650 results came up. So I think a lot of people like that for a title for their books. Well, maybe not all 650 had that title, but certainly the first page was book after book written by Christian authors with the title "Be Anxious for Nothing." Luckily, we actually have a few of those books on our bookshelf, so I looked through them. It's interesting that not one of them said that we should never be anxious, though they did talk about not having excessive worry or not letting your anxiety spiral out of control. But the focus of each of those books was the second part of the verse. Everything with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the next verse, and the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. Philippians 4, 6, and 7. Now, Major Ian Thomas, the founder of Cape and Ray Bible Schools, always said that the Bible is the best commentary on the Bible. And it's cost effective too, because when you buy the Bible, you get the commentary too. So I had prepared several verses that looked at what the Bible says in other areas about anxiety. And I realized my talk was getting really long. So I'm going to give you some homework to do. The easiest homework would be to read Paul's letter to the Philippians, where this verse, "be anxious for nothing," is. When you read Philippians, which is really a short book, you can read it in one sitting, look for words like distress or concern, especially when Paul talks about his friend Epaphroditus who's deathly ill. That resonated with me because that's one of my anxieties in this pandemic, is that someone I love will become ill and die. I realized that Paul spoke unashamedly and honestly about his concern and distress, which sounded very much what we would call anxiety when he talked about his friend Epaphroditus being ill. If you want the more advanced homework, I would suggest you look at the rest of Paul's epistles, where he seems to talk honestly about all his emotions, both joyful and distressing. You want even more advanced homework, look at the Psalms of David, where he speaks honestly about fear and feelings of abandonment by God. And if you want more advanced, I'd go to Lamentations. We don't know who wrote the book of Lamentations, perhaps Jeremiah, but he has a raw honesty as he talks about his emotional distress. It sets your teeth on edge. Literally, read it and you'll know what I'm talking about. All these authors had something in common. They were all honest about their emotional distress. They talked about concern, fear, and distress. And not once did they say, "but I shouldn't be feeling this way." They showed an intimacy with God in that they turned to God and talked to him when they experienced this distress. And they also knew how to listen and receive comfort from God. Now, I think the first two of these three responses is something that I'm not too bad at, if you don't mind me saying so. I'm learning to be honest about my emotions, and I'm quite good at rattling off a list to God when I pray about all the things I'm anxious about, often including a few suggestions about how he might want to resolve some of the situations. The third thing, listening to God and receiving comfort from him, is something that he's been teaching me more about during the pandemic. We'll talk about that later. So if we're not going to ignore the anxiety, push it away, I would suggest we do as the writers in the Bible that we talked about, Paul, David, and the writer of Lamentations, that we invite our anxiety in, that we curious about our anxiety and look at it honestly. When we do look at our anxieties honestly, we often see that we tend to overestimate threat, our mind goes to the worst case scenario, and we tend to underestimate our ability to cope. Perhaps the better way to say it is we underestimate the resources available to us, which will make us able to cope. It's like we see things in an unbalanced way. If I had the word threat written in the lower basket here on this scale, you'd get the idea that we're putting too much weight on the threat. And if I had our ability to cope on the higher basket on this scale, you'd get the idea that we're not putting enough weight on our ability to cope. But when we look at our anxieties honestly, recognizing that there is a basis for our fear, we're often able to bring it back into balance. It's true that the worst case scenario very seldom happens. And even if it did, we have resources that would make us able to cope. It's like we can turn the volume down on our anxiety when we look at it honestly and rationally. I think we're all familiar with the serenity prayer. Reinhold Niebuhr, if I'm saying that right, was a theologian who lived through the First and Second World War, as well as the 1918 pandemic. He wrote, "God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference." Often we waste a tremendous amount of energy and time trying to change things that we cannot change. Exercise that I often do with patients that sometimes helps with that is very high tech. It requires three things: pen, paper, and your brain. And I'm going to get us to work on that now. I'm going to go out of the PowerPoint. You go ahead and get a paper and a pen. So if you've got your pen and paper handy, we are going to draw a line across the top. Nice straight line like I did, and a line down the center. Now we're going to write accept on the top of one side of the sheet and change on the other side of the sheet. Now I'm going to ask each one of you to write down the things that we need to accept during this pandemic. I did this exercise with a group last week, and some of the ideas that we came up with, we have to accept that there is a pandemic. We don't know how long it will last. There are some government regulations that we can do nothing about. We will feel some isolation. And last thing that I think really resonated with me was that other people's actions are something that we usually need to accept. So we would like to be able to change people's actions by pointing out to them that it doesn't make sense or it's not the best thing for them or the community around them. The fact is that generally there's nothing we can do about other people's actions. So worrying about it, wasting energy about it doesn't help at all. So I would suggest that you add other things which you find that you're using time and energy on, that really there's nothing you can change. And there's something about writing it down on a piece of paper that seems to help you let it go. And that frees up our energy to the change side. So you can hold on to that sheet of paper and work yourself with the change side. I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint here. So we're going to look at some tools which help us regulate anxiety or help us build resilience. I think each one of us have our own toolbox, but it never hurts to try out a few extra tools sometimes. I'm going to discuss 3 M's and a G. How do you find out if these tools work for you? Well, you try them out. We call them behavioral experiments. You try the tool out and see if it helps your mood or helps you deal with difficult situations ahead. Behavioral experiments tend to last weeks, not days. The 3 M's that I'm going to discuss are from Dr. Sue Varma. She's a psychiatrist from New York University who's very good at communicating practical advice in a concise manner. And I've adapted them to use with my patients and added a G onto the end. First M is movement. I'm a family doctor, so you didn't really expect me not to talk about movement, did you? Movement doesn't have to be exercise per se. It can be yard work, housework, playing soccer with the kids in the backyard. Although I would never discourage you from taking a brisk walk when you feel anxiety building up, movement is most effective when regulating anxiety if it becomes a regular part of your day or week. Movement makes the body strong and resilient, and it makes the mind and emotions strong and resilient. Second is mindfulness. Mindfulness is paying attention to the present. Most of us tend to ruminate about the past and catastrophize about the future, and it requires discipline for us to actually pay attention and be in the present. Mindfulness is not talking and doing, but it's listening and being. The writers which I discussed earlier from the Bible, Paul, David, and the writer of Lamentations, knew how to be mindful. They knew how to sit with their anxiety, to be in the presence of God and be comforted with God by God. I would suggest we're all born to social distance. We tend to think of ourselves as extroverts or introverts, but none of us are 100% one or the other. We all fit somewhere along that continuum, and at least part of our day or week is best spent in solitude. Unfortunately, our North American culture, and I would suggest even our North American evangelical church culture, tends to overvalue extrovert traits and undervalue introvert traits. I would say that this pandemic is a good time for each of us to get in touch with our introvert side. If you're looking for a good book to read, I would suggest the book Quiet by Susan Cain, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking. She has an interesting chapter here where she looks at the evangelical church, though there's no indication that she herself is a believer. So it's very enlightening. So if you're looking for a book to read during this pandemic, I would suggest Susan Cain's. The third M is mastery. Mastery is finding meaning in your day. It is the feeling of accomplishment. Now, I think we've all seen the YouTube videos about someone day 1 and then day 50 or 60 of self-isolation. On day 1, they're getting up early, getting dressed, baking bread, eating, making sure they're going to eat healthy, exercising, perhaps cleaning out all the closets in their house, and learning a new language. by day 50 or 60, they're lying on the sofa in the same sweatsuit they've worn for the last week, binging on Netflix and ordering in fast food. Neither day 1 or day 50 is true mastery. Mastery is having achievable goals in your day. When Mike and I were walking across England, our ultimate goal was the North Atlantic, but each day we had the goal of what we wanted to cover that day, and it gave us a sense of mastery when we accomplished that. Now, the last tool is G. G is not grandma, though it ties in. I myself am about to become a grandmother, so I've been thinking about that quite a bit. The other day when I was working in the backyard, I started to imagine what life would be like in 20 years. That's when my grandson will be almost 20, and I will be 20 years older than I am now. I imagine my grandson asking me, Grandma, what was life like for you during the pandemic of 2020? I realize that I don't know exactly how I'd answer because it's not over yet, but I thought of some of the things I'd say. I'd tell him about the difficult times. I'd tell him about the death and the fear of death. I'd tell him about the isolation and the economic devastation. I would also tell them how life changed. We learned that we can do so much from home. Many of us can work from home. We can study from home. We can shop from home. We can have our doctor's visits from home. And we can have our church meetings from home. I imagine he wouldn't be too surprised by that. I'd tell him perhaps some of the stories of things that happened during the pandemic, like the Sunday afternoon when his grandma challenged his grandpa to a ping pong tournament. His grandfather won every game. I think he'd get a kick out of imagining his grandma and grandpa playing ping pong. And I tell him about the weekly video chats with his parents and his uncles, where we'd chat, we'd pray together, and we'd play virtual board games and laugh together. And he'd probably think that was pretty cool, or whatever word they'll use in 20 years from now. And as I thought about it, I thought I'd also tell him about the good things. There were less cars on the road, life slowed down, the air was cleaner, and I started to realize what was really important in life. And as I thought about it, I realized that just like the stars are brighter when it's dark, so we realize what we have to be grateful for. Gratitude is a discipline. It's something that we tend not to think about, especially during anxious times like this. But it's something that builds resistance and strength. It's something that requires us to actually think about what we are to be grateful for. So, like the stars shine brighter on a very dark night, so in the darkness of the pandemic, we can sometimes see more clearly what's really important in life and what are the precious gifts that God has given us. For me, it's time with people that I love. It's the simple joys of life, and it's the privilege of being in the presence of God. So the last exercise that I would leave with you, if you wish, is sometime in the next few days to sit down and ask yourself, what has God brought into focus for me during the dark time of this pandemic? What are the precious gifts that I have been given? And how can I continue to practice gratitude through the rest of this pandemic and in the journey beyond? So thank you so much for joining me for this talk about anxiety. God bless you as you face the trek ahead, and perhaps we'll talk again sometime. Bye-bye.